Every Saturday for nearly a year, a rancher rode 6 miles into town, bought the exact same slice of apple pie, and rode 6 miles back home, 50 Saturdays running by her own private count. And somewhere around the 30th, the baker selling it to him had started to suspect the pie was never really the point. Wyoming Territory, 1887. What neither of them knew yet is that this quiet, careful ritual was about to be tested by two very different kinds of trouble: a fever that would leave a man alone and half collapsed against his own fence line with nobody for 6 miles to notice, and a banknote that would force the woman who loved him to answer a question her own mother never got the chance to ask. Did she want to be needed, or did she want to be chosen? Stay to the end. The answer she gives on the day that note comes due changes both their lives. Every Saturday without fail, Nora Hartley set out the same table at the edge of the market square, bread stacked in neat rows, jars of preserves catching the morning light. A line of pies she'd started baking before sunrise, still warm enough to fog the glass jars beside them. And every Saturday without fail, she found herself watching the road from the west for a particular rider. Thomas Reed ran a modest cattle operation 6 miles out, close enough that folks in that part of the territory counted him a neighbor rather than a stranger. He'd been buying the same slice of apple pie from her table for the better part of a year, nearly 50 Saturdays running by her own private count. Though Nora had begun to suspect somewhere around the 30th that the pie was no longer the main reason he came. He rode up that morning the same as always, dismounted with the careful ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime on horseback, and tipped his hat before he'd even reached the table. "Miss Hartley, Mr. Reed." "Apple again? Wouldn't dream of changing my order this late in our acquaintance." It was on that particular Saturday, with a warmth in the air that made the whole market feel a little slower than usual, that Nora finally said what she'd been considering saying for weeks. 50 Saturdays running," she said, cutting a fresh piece and holding it out on a plate instead of wrapping it in paper the way she usually did. "Seems only fair you eat it here for once instead of carrying it all the way home alone." Thomas looked at the plate, then at her, with an expression that took its time settling into a smile. "Only if the baker comes with it." Nora laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and set down her apron long enough to sit with him on the bench at the edge of her table. Mrs. Pruitt at the next stall watched the whole exchange over the rim of her coffee cup. "Sun's barely up," she said to no one in particular once Thomas had ridden off. "Either that man loves pie more than any Christian ought to, or this stopped being about breakfast some months back." "It's pie, Mrs. Pruitt," Nora said Mrs. Pruitt in the tone of a woman who had counted considerably more than 50 Saturdays herself, and went back to her eggs. The visits after that stopped pretending to be about pie at all, though it took several Saturdays, not one, for either of them to admit as much. On a Saturday in late spring, rain came through sideways hard enough to clear half the market before noon. Most stallholders had packed up by the time Thomas rode in anyway, soaked clean through, dismounting at her table like the weather was a minor inconvenience. "You rode 6 miles through that for a slice of pie. Was told the baker might be here." He wrung water from his hat brim. "The baker might have had the good sense to close early. Then it's fortunate for me that she didn't." He ate the pie standing under the small awning she'd rigged over her table, the rain drumming steadily above them, and neither made any particular effort to hurry the visit along, though the market square had emptied out around them entirely by the time he finally rode home. On another Saturday, the leg of her table gave way under a full pie tin, sending 3 loaves rolling into the dust before Thomas's hand was under the corner, steadying it faster than she'd managed to reach it herself. "I've got tools," Nora said, already pulling a small kit from beneath the cloth folded at the back of the table. "I can see that." He held the wood steady while she knelt and tightened the joint herself, watching her work with something that looked less like surprise and more like approval. "Your father teach you that?" "My father taught me which end of a hammer to hold. The rest I worked out on my own, same as most things." "Seems you worked it out well enough," he said, and didn't offer as some men might have. To finish the job for her, only kept the legs steady until she was satisfied, which she noticed and appreciated more than she said. On a third Saturday, she made him a pie with half the usual sugar, telling him only she was testing a new recipe for a customer who preferred things less sweet. He ate the whole slice without complaint and asked mildly whether the mercantile had raised its sugar prices again. Something like that, Nora said, and didn't tell him for weeks that she'd noticed back in April the particular face he made at anything too sweet, a small private observation she kept the way she kept most things that mattered to her, turning them over quietly before letting anyone else know she'd noticed it all. Mrs. Prout, watching this unfold across several Saturdays, eventually took to calling it *courting by crust, a phrase Nora pretended not to hear each time it was said within earshot. It was Thomas on one of those Saturdays who asked the question that surprised her more than she let show. "You sell out most weeks before noon," he said, nodding at her nearly empty table. "Ever think what you do with a proper shop, 4 walls, an oven that isn't hauled out to a market stall every Saturday morning?" Nora was quiet a moment. "I think about it most days. There's a little building past the mercantile, empty since the harness maker moved on. I've priced it in my head a dozen times and talked myself out of it just as many. Why talk yourself out of it? Because wanting something that large for myself alone feels like tempting fate. Easier to keep at a table and a Saturday habit than a debt with my name on it." Thomas looked at her a long moment. "Seems to me you're charging considerably less for these pies than they're worth." A woman running a real shop wouldn't need to. It was a small thing, the way he'd noticed her prices instead of only her company. But Nora found she thought about it longer than the comment strictly deserved. She noticed, too, that Thomas never lingered past a certain hour, always riding off before the market thinned entirely. "You never stay long," she said to him once. "Ranch doesn't tend itself. 6 miles isn't so far you couldn't spare another quarter hour." He didn't answer that directly, and Nora, watching him ride west that afternoon, found herself wondering, not for the first time though more pointedly than before, what kind of house was waiting for him at the end of that road, and why he seemed in such a hurry to get back to something he never once described. They didn't rush toward each other's histories, it came out in pieces. "My mother was useful to everyone she knew," Nora told him one Saturday, apropos of very little. "I'm not sure anyone ever once asked what she wanted. Did anyone ever tell her the work could wait?" "Not often enough," Nora said, and didn't say more that day. Thomas didn't press her to. It was several Saturdays later that he told her in pieces of his own about his wife. "Her name was Eliza," he said, 4 years gone now. "Fever took her quicker than seemed fair given how much of her there was to lose." He turned his hat over in his hands. "Sometimes wanting another life feels like saying the first one wasn't enough." He rubbed his thumb along the brim. "I know that isn't true. Knowing hasn't made it easier." Nora didn't offer comfort he hadn't asked for. She only said, "Grief makes rules no one agreed to, Thomas. You're allowed to stop obeying them whenever you're ready, and let the rest sit between them, unfinished, the way most true things were at first." There came a Saturday deeper into summer when Thomas nearly asked her to come see the ranch for herself, got as far as "you might like to see the asterisk" before something in his own nerve failed him. And he finished the sentence with asterisk new foal instead, as though that had been his meaning all along. Nora let him have the retreat. "I'd like to see a foal sometime," she said, mild as anything, though both of them understood perfectly well what he'd almost said instead. He rode home that Saturday slower than usual, turning something over in his mind the whole 6 miles, and did not, in the end, ride back out to invite her properly before the following week arrived, and swallowed the moment whole. The next Saturday, Nora set aside the best slice before sunrise, the way she always did. By noon, it sat untouched. She told herself it meant nothing, a late calving, a fence needing mending, any of a dozen ordinary reasons. She sold the slice to someone else near closing and rode home, telling herself, without quite believing it, there'd be a simple explanation come the following Saturday. There wasn't. The second Saturday came and went the same as the first, and by early afternoon Nora found she couldn't keep her hands steady enough to wrap a single loaf of bread. Thomas had described the road to his place often enough over the months, west, past the dry creek, north at the split cottonwood. 3 miles on toward the low ridge that she found she didn't need to ask anyone the way. She closed her table early, left the unsold bread with Mrs. Prout, and rode west before she'd fully decided that was what she meant to do. The ride felt longer than 6 miles. She found him in the yard, half collapsed against the fence rail, a badly infected cut along one leg wrapped in a bandage gone dark and stiff. His face flushed with a fever he'd clearly been fighting alone for days. "Fell," Thomas managed, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. Horse spooked at something in the brush. "Been meaning to get into town." "You've been meaning to for 2 Saturdays, Nora said, already working the stiff bandage loose with hands that were, for the first time since she'd known him, not entirely steady. "That's considerably longer than meaning to generally allows a man," Thomas read. She got her shoulder under his good arm and half-walked, half-dragged him to the house, cursing under her breath at his weight and the foolishness of a man who lived so far out with no one to notice if he didn't come back from a fall. Inside, she got him onto the bed, cleaned what she could of the wound with water heated hastily on the stove, and understood within minutes this was beyond what her own knowledge could safely manage alone. She shouted across the near pasture until the Ferris boy working his family's fence line half a mile off came at a run and sent him riding hard for the town doctor. The doctor arrived within the hour and set to work at once, speaking to Nora directly rather than around her, the way some town doctors were inclined to do with women who weren't kin. "The infection's taken hold but not past what we can manage," he said, washing his hands. "He'll need the dressing changed twice daily and someone watching the fever close for the next 2 nights at least. I can't spare the time myself." "Can you manage it, or shall I send for a neighbor woman?" "I can manage it," Nora said, and did not examine in that moment why the answer had come so quickly and so certainly. The house, she came to understand over those first hours, had the kind of quiet that belonged to a place built for 2 people and lived in, for 4 years now, by only one. A woman's shawl still hung by the door, faded from disuse rather than wear, exactly the sort of garment a person keeps not out of need, but because taking it down would mean admitting something the heart isn't ready to admit. A second chair sat pushed against the wall in the kitchen, plainly unused. Nora didn't move the shawl and didn't move the chair. She only cooked what the kitchen could supply, thin broth the first night, plain stew the second, and kept the wound clean twice a day, exactly as instructed, and sat with him through the worst of the fever on the second night when he wasn't entirely certain by his own later account which decade he believed himself to be living in. The fever broke before dawn on the 3rd day. Thomas woke slowly, his eyes finding the ceiling first, then the woman sitting in the chair beside his bed, her own eyes red-rimmed from 2 nights without proper sleep. The first word he spoke clearly was not his late wife's name, it was Nora's. By the 3rd evening, with Thomas well enough to sit up properly, he reached over without much ceremony and drew the unused chair away from the wall, setting it across from his own at the table. "You've stood through enough suppers," he said. "Sit." Nora sat. Neither of them mentioned whose chair it had once been, though both understood well enough. "I haven't let anyone close since Eliza," Thomas admitted later that evening, once the meal was cleared. "Not because I didn't notice you, Nora. I noticed you the first Saturday you sold me that pie. I told myself noticing wasn't the same as allowing anything to come of it." "It's not coward's math," Nora said when he trailed off. "It's grief. It makes its own rules." "Nora," Thomas said, testing the name out loud for what she realized was the first time. "Thomas," she said back. And something in the way they both said it made clear that whatever had been unofficial between them for 50 Saturdays had just quietly become something else. Thomas's leg mended steadily over the following 2 weeks, and Nora stayed on past the point the doctor's instructions strictly required, not out of obligation now, but because she found she wasn't in any hurry to stop. But by the following week, with the wound closed and Thomas steady enough to manage the ranch alone again, Nora understood the reason she'd had for staying had run its course. She packed her things to return to town, and it was there, at her horse, trying and failing to find the right way to ask her to stay, that Thomas said the thing that landed wrong. The house needs you, he said. Nora went very still. A house may need curtains, Thomas. A man ought to know the difference between a house needing someone and a man wanting her. She swung up onto her horse before he could answer. I've spent my whole life being needed. I came out here because I wanted to, not because your kitchen was short a pair of hands. She rode back to town that afternoon and did not come out to the ranch the following week. Or the week after that. He spent those 2 weeks turning her words over the same way he'd once turned over his fear of Eliza's memory, and came slowly to understand what he'd actually said and what she'd actually heard. He rode into town on a Saturday, not toward her market table, but toward the empty building past the mercantile, the one she'd priced in her head a dozen times and never once let herself claim. He was standing in front of it, measuring the width of the door with a length of twine, when Nora found him there. What are you doing? Getting the measurements you'll need if you decide the ovens go along the back wall. Asked the harness maker's widow what she'd take for it. It's less than you'd think. He looked at her plainly. I didn't come to ask you back to my kitchen, Nora. I came because I want to see you have the one you've been talking yourself out of for a year. Nora looked at the empty building, then at him. You're not offering to buy it for me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. No, I'm offering to stand here holding the twine while you decide whether you want it enough to ask the bank yourself. That's the whole of my part in it, unless you want more than that. He paused. I don't want you because the house is quieter without you. I want you because every place is. Nora went to the bank herself the following week, papers in hand, and came out with a loan smaller than she'd feared and terms fairer than she'd expected. The bank clerk, it turned out, had a particular fondness for her cinnamon rolls. Thomas came into town most days that month to help with the work the building needed, tearing out the old harness racks, reinforcing the back wall, building the long counter himself from lumber hauled in from his own land, rather than bought new. You don't need to do all this, Nora told him, watching him plane a board smooth on what would become her front counter. I know I don't need to, he said, not looking up. I'd like to anyway. There's a difference, I'm told, between what a person needs and what they want to give freely. I mean to get some practice at the second kind. She let him keep at it, and found over the weeks that followed that watching a man build something with his own hands for a business that would carry only her name above the door was a different kind of romance than she'd ever expected to want, and considerably more lasting than flowers would have been. The shop's first winter was leaner than either of them had let themselves expect. Business at a Saturday market table was one thing: familiar faces, low overhead, no rent hanging over every unsold loaf. A proper shop with 4 walls and a landlord's note coming due each month was a different arithmetic entirely. By January, the bank note Nora had signed alone was 2 payments behind, and the same clerk who'd once been persuaded by a warm cinnamon roll came around with a formal notice this time. Apologetic but firm that the terms required the account be brought current within 30 days or the note would be called and the property reviewed for the bank's own use. Nora didn't tell Thomas at first. She sat at her own counter after closing 3 nights running, tallying figures that refused to come out kindly no matter how many times she added them, and told herself she'd manage it the way she'd managed everything before him, quietly, alone, without asking anyone to carry what was rightfully hers to carry. Thomas found out anyway, the way small towns arrange for such things to be found out. The bank clerk mentioned it, not unkindly, while buying feed at the mercantile, to a man he didn't realize had any particular stake in the Hartley Bakery's accounts. Thomas came to the shop that same evening, the 30-day notice already folded once in his coat pocket, having stopped at the bank himself first. You could have told me, he said, setting the notice on her counter. I was going to manage it. I know you were. That's not the same as needing to do it without a single soul knowing you were carrying it. He was quiet a moment. I went by the bank on my way in. I could cover the 2 payments outright, Nora. Settle it by morning and neither of us would need to think on it again. Nora looked at him a long moment and he watched her arrive, almost visibly, at the exact place he'd been afraid she might. That's not what I want from you, she said. You already know that's not what I want from you. I know, Thomas said. I offered anyway because it was the easy thing to offer, and I wanted you to hear me offer it and refuse it plainly. Rather than wonder for the rest of our lives whether I'd have done it behind your back if you'd let me, he set his hat on the counter. What I actually came to ask is different. The ranch had a fair year. I've got calves I can sell early before the spring market at a worse price than I'd get waiting, but a price that covers what your note needs now. I'd like to loan you that on paper at whatever interest the bank itself would charge, recorded properly at the county office, same as any other creditor, not a gift. Not your name and mine on the deed together, a loan plainly written that you pay back on your own schedule the way you'd pay back any bank in the territory. Nora was quiet, turning that over. You'd take a loss on the calves. I would. It's still my choice to take it, same as it was your choice to open this shop in the first place. I'm not asking to be part owner of something you built, Nora. I'm asking to be listed same as any other lender who believed in the investment. There's considerable difference between the two, and I mean to keep on the right side of it. She looked at the notice on the counter, then at him. You'd let me refuse this too. I would. Wouldn't think less of you for it either way. But I'd rather you refuse the real offer than accept a version of help I never actually made, because you assumed I meant something bigger than I did. Nora signed the note 2 days later. At the county office, in front of the same clerk who'd once been won over by cinnamon rolls, with terms plain enough that both of them could recite the schedule from memory before spring. She paid the last installment back in full the following autumn, a week before the shop's first anniversary, and framed the paid note behind her counter beside the original deed, not as sentiment exactly, though it was partly that, but as a plain record of the particular kind of help she'd been willing to accept and the kind she never once had to. We'll manage, Thomas said more than once that lean winter, on the evenings he stayed to help her close up. We will, Nora agreed. Provided the town develops a considerably stronger appetite for bread before spring. It was Mrs. Pruitt in the end who helped turn the tide, mentioning the shop to every farm wife who came through for eggs until Hartley's bakery became, by slow and unglamorous degrees, the place a body went not just for Saturday pie, but for the bread that fed a family the rest of the week besides. By the time the snow cleared, the ledger Nora kept behind the counter had begun finally to add up the way she'd hoped it might. She never once, through that lean winter, considered closing the shop and keeping only the market table. Thomas never once suggested she should. He asked her to marry him some weeks later on the porch of the ranch, the same porch where he'd taken his first unsteady steps after the fever broke, leaning on her arm the whole short distance. I've spent 4 years telling myself I'd had my share of luck already, he said. I don't believe that anymore. He took her hand. Marry me, Nora, not because either of us needs tending. Because I'd like the years ahead better with you in them. And because I mean to spend the rest of mine making sure you never once have to choose between being wanted and being your own woman. That's the correct way to ask, Nora said. And said yes before he'd finished laughing at his own relief. Before the wedding, Thomas took Eliza's shawl down from its place by the door and folded it carefully into a small trunk. You needn't hide every sign that she lived here, Nora told him, watching. No, Thomas said, but I think it's time the door held something that belongs to the life we're living now. They married that autumn in the small church at the edge of town. Half the congregation had spent the better part of a year watching Thomas buy the same slice of pie every Saturday without once admitting why, and took no small satisfaction in finally understanding it. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the second row and cried more openly than anyone expected of her. Nora signed the papers on the empty building the same month, with Thomas's name beside hers as guarantor on the original banknote and nowhere else on the deed. He'd offered once to put his own name on the storefront alongside hers, and she declined just as plainly. It's mine, she told him. You've made that possible. That doesn't make it half yours. Wouldn't dream of arguing otherwise, Thomas said, and meant it. 4 years on, Hartley's bakery was busier most Saturday mornings than the old market table had ever been, a line of regulars out the door by 9. Shelves of bread gone half empty by mid-morning, the smell of cinnamon and butter crust reaching halfway down the street. Thomas still ran the ranch 6 miles west, still worked it mostly alone except during branding season, and still came every Saturday for his slice of apple pie, rain or shine. The way he had for years before either of them had admitted what the ritual actually meant. He came now, though, with a small girl on his hip, not yet 3, red-haired like her mother, already possessed of her father's patient stubbornness. Reaching for the pie plate before he'd even managed to set her down on the counter. "Same order?" Nora asked, smiling, wiping flour from her hands. "Wouldn't dream of changing it this late in our acquaintance," Thomas said. Nora laughed, the same real laugh she'd laughed the very first Saturday he'd said it, all those Saturdays ago. Back when the words had still carried the shy weight of two people testing how far a joke could carry an unspoken thing. She cut 2 slices instead of one for her husband, one for her daughter, who ate hers with considerably less patience than either parent, and for herself. The last bite of the first pie she'd baked that morning, eaten standing at her own counter, in the shop she'd built with her own name above the door. In the life she'd chosen rather than merely earned. Behind the counter, framed alongside the original deed, the paid note still hung where she'd put it, a plain, unglamorous record that on the one occasion it would have been easiest to simply let a man solve her problem outright, she'd asked for something narrower and fairer instead. And he'd been willing to give her exactly that and nothing more than that, because he understood by then precisely what the difference was worth to her. Outside, Thomas's horse waited at the rail, unbothered as ever, exactly the way it always had, on every one of the 50 Saturdays that had started all of it, and every Saturday since. Nora Hartley offered a slice of pie to a widowed rancher on an ordinary Saturday, never expecting it to become the first small habit of an entire life built together. Thomas Reed spent 4 years believing loving again would dishonor what he'd already lost, and learned, slowly and imperfectly, that grief's rules are not the only ones worth keeping. And Nora got the thing her own mother never had the chance to ask for, to be wanted, not merely needed, and to build something entirely her own. Alongside a man willing to hold the twine and step back every single time it mattered that he did.